Yeah, no, hi everyone. It's great to meet you. Today we're going to talk about hopefully something that's not a boring topic. It's going to be talking about a kind of overall crash course about the EUA Act, and hopefully we're going to walk away with firstly understanding why you should bother about the EUA Act, and then also what you can do as an AI professional as part of this. So a really brief intro into me. I was a data scientist for about 3+ years, and I was then working in the life sciences and pharma sector. Basically, I came to a kind of crossroads in my career. Do I just deliver value with AI without communicating commercial value or understanding societal benefits and disadvantages? So I said no to that. So I moved towards the kind of Yoda angle, where then I'm creating value with AI, but through communicating commercial value as well as understanding societal benefits and risks. So that's a little bit about me. And today we're going to talk about these items. We're going to firstly answer the question why I should be even here in the first place, about why we should bother knowing about AI legislation. And then the next part is then hopefully after convincing you of that fact, we're going to talk about the EUA Act itself and the different aspects of the EUA Act. And then following from that, we're going to follow into the kind of juicier bits of this talk, which talks about the actionable steps as AI pros that we can take that have been split down quite nicely into 3 topics of documentation, implementation, and compliance. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and we'll answer the question of why should we even bother knowing about AI law as AI professionals, right? So let's ask one question here. Do you as AI professionals want people to feel unsafe? Or do you want people to actually create models that make people unwell or risk their health? Or do you want to create models that actually strip away people's fundamental rights? I mean, hopefully I shouldn't see people nodding to that, right? I think we're all in agreement that we as creators of these AI technologies also have a human responsibility to make sure that health, safety, and fundamental rights are protected for the end users, right? So that's the human aspect. The next part is about your professional aspect. So here it's about improving your code of practice, but I think more importantly, is actually talking about how do we get involved in the bigger conversations with the commercial teams and trying to use compliance as a language in between the technical and non-technical commercial teams. And then beyond that, it's then what the value that you deliver then as an individual. So it's then one, providing clarity on the ever-changing AI landscape. And as we've seen with the California AI bill and that being scrapped, again, the landscape is changing consistently, especially with the development and the scale of development of this technology. And then also another one is to help organizations to avoid regulatory fines, right? We'll see in the next slide how severe they can be. But look, basically the most important aspect is that less regulatory fines go out, there's a higher chance that that money goes into your pocket instead. Clarifying on this kind of value creation point, right? I kind of separated it into the clarification of the landscape and avoiding the fines. And look, we can see from a survey that was recently that was taken early in the year, right, that most organizations are still struggling to understand this EUA Act, and it's been published since August and it's been developed since 2021. So with that, still organizations need some clarity over that. And that's a position where that's a position that we can fill as AI professionals to, again, create that common language between technical and commercial teams. And then for avoiding fines, again, we can see the kind of severity of the fines, but it depends on the severity of the case, of course. So hopefully I've kind of convinced you of that fact that we should start to learn about AI law. Let's focus on one that's obviously really relevant for us, right, which is the EUA Act. And so it's the first piece of kind of horizontal legislation. So that means it applies to all industries that use or develop artificial intelligence. And so it stratifies it, as we'll see a little bit later, but it focuses on health, safety, and fundamental rights. And here I've given like a little brief timeline of what's been happening in the background. So the next part is then saying, okay, with this EU Act, what does it cover? What's the scope? And so it's defined in Article 3 of what an AI system is. This is part of the kind of OECD definition of AI. And for those that don't like reading a bunch of text but like seeing pretty pictures, I've turned it into a pretty picture here, where basically an AI system is something that has defined inputs, adapts and trains through a machine-based learning system that generates outputs in the form of predictions, content, or recommendations, which then influences our decisions, right? So then that's the scope. Let's have a look at what it covers. So basically, the EU Act is kind of formed in 3 aspects. One about risk hierarchy and understanding where a model fits in that risk hierarchy. There's another part that talks about the general purpose AI models. So these are more in the kind of Gen AI domain. And then you have transparency obligations, which we'll also cover. First one we'll look at is the risk hierarchy. And so basically it's stratified into 4 layers, from unacceptable being the worst and minimal being the better option, obviously. And this is basically increasing from minimal to unacceptable, increasing the risk to health, safety, and fundamental rights. And here I've just given a kind of few examples of what can be put into each of these different categories. And so the question we might ask from this is then, essentially from this risk hierarchy, how do we classify, right? And basically it's up to organizations to actually evaluate that risk level for themselves for each AI system that they implement. And so I've gone with the proviso saying work from the highest risk level first, and then work your way down through what I call the justification framework. And that is something that I'm going to introduce to you now in terms of how do we justify it. We justify it on 4 key aspects. So health, safety, and fundamental rights, obviously as inspired by the EU Act, but also another important point about human autonomy and human oversight, which is about human versus AI control. And I'll cover each of these now. So the first one is health. So here in this one, we want to ask these kind of fundamental questions here. One, does the AI system have an impact on health outcomes, right? Or will the development of the AI system impact communities? So we're talking about land and water usage of data centers, and there's plenty of papers and reports that talk about energy and then particularly water and land resource usage within AI development. The next one is safety. So here we're focusing really on personal data, if it's going to be exposed, and if there's going to be any loss of privacy with this implementation of an AI system. And here also we're talking about cybersecurity. So we're talking about whether the model is liable to data poisoning or model evasion. And so data poisoning essentially is just when you manipulate the data, whether it be the input features or the labels during the training phase. A model evasion is when it then occurs during inference time, or hyperparameters can be changed as well from remotely as well. Next is then fundamental rights. Here I've included a kind of subset that we're taking from this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here I've just, taken a subset that has quite a lot of interaction with AI models that we're seeing these days. And then finally, human versus AI control, which then talks about these kind of fundamental questions of who or what executes the decision and how much does the AI system impact the decision-making process. So it's understanding where the human fits in the decision-making process and how much the human has control over that decision-making process. And so all these kind of 4 aspects come quite nicely into this kind of tabular format, where basically organizations define that risk level for themselves of how much of a risk an AI system has on health, safety, and fundamental rights, but also understanding and evaluating the human versus AI control element of that system. And so from that, you kind of get an overall global picture. And that way, then you can classify it as, for example, a high-risk AI system from this rubric. So what I'm going to do from this point is I'm going to give you two examples, two case studies, and I want you to have a go at guessing which level you think it is. So I'll give you this case example. I'll leave you guys to think about it for a good 30 seconds of what you think to this particular use case, of which level it should be. And I want you to think about the kind of justification framework of health, safety, fundamental rights, human versus AI control.
So people in the online audience, please raise your hand if you want to answer. From the room, we think maybe unacceptable.
Okay. Yeah. No, really, really interesting there. I think in this case, it's like there is definitely cause for it to be an unacceptable system as well. Unacceptable systems are basically ones that really do go against EU values. So in this case, really does have an impact on health, safety, fundamental rights. And again, having a look at the AI, human versus AI control. So here, in terms of the immigration aspect, it maybe has a really high impact on fundamental rights, potentially on the safety of that individual as well, because then what happens if they get denied and then it's unsafe for them to live in their home country? So that could also be very high. Health, maybe not as much directly. Human versus AI control, again, that's something worth asking within the organization as to how much the AI system is actually executing that decision. But of course, it's definitely along the high / unacceptable, depending on these other parameters in that justification framework. Grand, let's give you another example. So here we have a customer service chatbot for an airline company.
Is it Ryanair or is it a different airline?
Very good question. It's a non-specified airline company. It's any random one.
Yeah, I think someone wrote.
What have we got?
Low, high, minimal.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So we've got like a mixed picture. Really interesting. And again, it's again subject to other parameters, right, in this justification framework, but it's more likely limited because again, health, safety, not as much. Fundamental rights, not significant, I wouldn't say. Human versus AI control, maybe. But something worth considering from a commercial perspective, right? There's been a case against Air Canada who implemented a chatbot that essentially hallucinated on policies. So essentially made up policies that didn't exist. And so went to a court trial and basically set a precedence now that companies are liable for text that is on their website, but also text that is generated from their chatbot. So basically, whatever is generated from that chatbot, the company is also liable to fulfilling those obligations as well that were set by those chatbots as well. So definitely worth considering when you are using a chatbot in your organization to really evaluate the risks that can come about from this model and also being prepared for legal challenges that come about and being proactive rather than reactive to these legal challenges. Okay, so
we also had we also had another question prior to this in the chat from Tab. Where's the government exception on the rubric? Can you?
Yeah.
Do you understand the question? I'm not sure.
There's yes. So it's nuanced in that when models are used for law enforcement or other particular purposes related to government, then these obligations that I'm about to say aren't particularly relevant in those cases. But again, it's worth reading through the text to make sure that the use case and the purpose is then matched to what it says in the legislation. So no, very good question to mention that. Of course, there's exceptions within those certain cases, but worth considering and reading the text a little bit further for those. So no, good question. So we've had these examples. We're now going to talk about the risk obligations, then all the way from minimal to prohibited systems. So the first one is minimal. And here in the minimal one, it doesn't define anything particularly strict. It talks about following a kind of voluntary code of conduct. And so it focuses on these particular aspects of AI literacy, making sure that these systems are accessible to a wide range of individuals, and also importantly to focus on the environmental sustainability of these technologies, right? Then again, there's not particularly any focus on limited risk systems. So again, the obligations will be pretty much the same as the minimal risk systems, where we then look at the voluntary code of conduct from the AI office. What the EU AI Act really does focus on are high risk and prohibited. So high risk here, we're talking about a few things. One is conformity assessment, registering that AI system with the central EU database, which is to be defined, and also to develop human oversight measures to ensure that you review the model's behavior over time. So then we might be thinking, okay, conformity assessment, what is it really about? What does it mean by an audit, etc.? And what do we audit even against, right? So one aspect of that is the 42001 standard, which has been developed and released in December 2023. And it talks about an artificial intelligence management system. And what that really is saying you're looking at all the products that you either use, develop, or deploy, and you're evaluating the risks both internally and externally, and then finding appropriate controls that can effectively reduce your risk. And what that does basically is make sure that you're developing trust then with suppliers to then make sure that the processes that you have in place are at least reducing the risk. So in the same way as that airline company with Air Canada, they could evaluate that risk, understand that risk, and then also treat that risk with relevant controls. But more importantly, it's there to also continually improve as well. So then you're adapting to the risk landscape of tomorrow. Beyond that, then we have unacceptable risk, and then therefore they're just basically taken off the market. And so they're due to be taken off the market within 6 months of publication from August. So then that's the kind of risk schema framework. We're now going to talk about GPAI, or general purpose AI. And so the scope of this really talks about really large models. They have really high generality, and they can perform a wide range of tasks. So basically, we're talking about the GPT-4s, we're talking about Llama, etc., right? And the obligations I've put towards the right-hand side, technical documentation we're going to cover a little bit later on, but the next part talks about the safety angle. So it talks about red teaming, to then talk about how do we make sure that our model is robust to any attacks. And of course, there's strategies that we can implement to that. On top of that GPAI definition, they also talk about systemic risk for those particular models that are really huge, both in parameters and also reach. And so obviously there's increased risk whenever that AI technology is more widespread, therefore the risk is more widespread as well. So it's defined by kind of 2 different angles. One is about whether it has a certain number of floating point operations, or it's evaluated by these different criteria. The obligations are pretty much similar, but again, with a focus on cybersecurity. Next point is then transparency, where these are just for systems that have direct interaction with humans. So these can be like ChatGPT-4, etc. Any chatbot kind of interaction will be subjected to these obligations. And then to put it all into perspective, we have this time frame where basically the certain rules will apply at different intervals. And as you can see, GPI rules come in later on next year, and high-risk systems will then be within the 2-year mark. But then more importantly, let's get to the really juicy part of this talk, right, as promised, which is then the actionable steps for AI pros. And I've split it into 3 different sections where we have documentation, implementation, and compliance. And so within documentation, I talk about 2 different ideas. One is documents that belong in a repository, and ones that belong outside of the repository that are part of the product specification. So in the repository, we're talking really about 3 documents. One, a very beloved document, the README file. Next is about a model card, and then requirements, which, yeah, I'm sure we know of in the Python development context. So in the README file, we should really include these kind of aspects, right? In terms of intended purpose of the AI system, does it interact with any hardware or software? And then also training and testing processes, and yeah, a brief description of the user interface. The next one is about a model card, to just simply provide model metadata, to talk about model architecture or even estimated energy consumption during training. And then the requirements, which nothing new there, just basically, again, listing the versions for that AI system to then operate, so it can then be passed down the value chain. Within product specification, we then have a few things. So one is about instructions for use. And this is just to basically highlight what people can and can't do, and also human oversight measures as well on top of that. On top of that, we then also have an acceptable use policy. So then basically saying, how do you properly use it? And also the disciplinary process that comes into place when you violate any acceptable use. And so beyond that, it's also worth looking beyond deployment into the post-market idea, where post-deployment, where basically we're looking at a surveillance strategy. So we're defining internally what is model drift, and how do we evaluate this? And how do we also then decommission it when we put in a new and better improved model in a later date? The next part is then implementation, where I break it down into kind of programming, the really, really fun bit that we do on a day-to-day basis, and then the model optimization and evaluation part. So in programming, we're really just focusing on logging to basically understand user activity and user usage with the model. And here it's again to provide human oversight, right? So then you can review those logs, review user activity, and define who is using it acceptably or not, and also evaluating risks, again, that are associated with user activity. A more fun topic is about model optimization and evaluation. So here we can look at putting in transparency into our models. So a few ideas, again, which are quite rudimentary, but still quite key in the area in explainable AI, are 2 things: Shapley values and line. So Shapley values basically allows you to understand the individual contributions of each feature to a given prediction. And Lime essentially simplifies the decision boundary and zooms really, really close in, so you can understand where that line is and where the positive and the negative class is, for example. And it's the nice thing as well is that it's model agnostic as well, so it can be used across different architectures. And then another really interesting topic is about using fairness metrics as a way of evaluating model performance. And so there's a growing catalog of fairness metrics from OECD AI Policy Observatory from the academic field to basically give you guidance and even access to some GitHub repositories as well that implement these metrics and can be included then into model evaluation. Then finally, we have compliance. So here I split it into passive and active compliance, where passive compliance talks about internal auditing. So looking inside your organization and saying, okay, what risks do we have? How risky are they? And what strategies can we come up with to reduce or control these risks? And then when we have those systems in place, we might want to then verify that process then externally, so we can show that with suppliers, for instance. So this is when third-party audits come into the frame here, where essentially here these would be independent people, independent competent individuals that come and evaluate the systems that you've got in place, and basically gives you a certification to say, yes, you are implementing these processes and really aiming to effectively reduce these AI-related risks. So to summarize these actionable steps, we have documentation, implementation, and compliance here, and the respective different subfields. And here, we can find a way to actually incorporate these items in the short, medium, and the long term as well. And then one thing to just finally consider and leave you with is, one thing to consider is that at the moment, we might see a compliance check right towards the end before deployment. There's quite a few things wrong with that. One, well, main reason is that you're spending all the time, money, additional resources to build and train this model, collect data, etc. And then you come towards the very end and then you find it's actually not compliant. Then you have to go back square one, or at least the previous process, to get it right. Instead, I'm going to leave you with a different idea. Why don't we have a kind of responsible AI development cycle that goes over these different processes, that evaluates the documentation, implementation, and compliance, and continually improving on those processes. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions or comments?
Thank you, Alex. Super interesting. Yeah, we already have questions. I think Fredrik, you were first.
All right. Yeah, thanks for a really good talk. I guess I have two questions, but I'll start with one.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering whether there are any software that can help you with either model risk management software or compliance software, or both.
Really good question, actually. I think that from my own experience so far, there seems to be a gap in the market for that sort of idea, where you're evaluating the risk level and also helping organizations to understand compliance. There's obviously organizations that are slowly walking into the AI governance atmosphere. So I'll leave you to do the research on that one. But there's quite a few organizations that at least help towards getting compliant to the EU AI Act. So there's definitely resources out there to get you there as well.
Thank you.
Tab.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. And so my company, we make medical devices, which falls in Annex 3 there as a company that needs to think everything might be high risk. But the idea of safety, that's something that I really didn't understand until this call, because when I was reading that and reading some of the other kind of annotations in Annex 3, it was about companies that I started thinking about safety being something more about like physical health or like human well-being, but it seems from this that no, safety is kind of more pointing towards privacy and data. Is that correct? Is that correct interpretation? Or?
Yeah, no, really good point there, Tab. So basically, as a kind of backstory to the EUA Act, there's a high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, right? And these were a group of experts that were kind of commissioned to help with matters on AI policy and the EUA Act. And so they first came together to produce one deliverable, which was about trustworthy AI guidelines. And essentially there they highlight 7 key AI ethics principles. And in one of them, it's technical robustness and safety. So they're roped together because of a few things. One, it's about understanding that when a model gets attacked, then the model is robust, aka it will be delivering consistent predictions regardless of any attempts to perturbate data anywhere. So for example, take an incident where developers in a Tesla testing trial, what they did was they taped over basically the gaps on the 3 to make an 8 for a speed sign. And so what happened was the Tesla vehicle registered that speed limit, not as 35 miles per hour, but 85 miles per hour. So it's those types of aspects that we also need to think about. So it's not only about safety from the health perspective, but because that's already covered in the health angle of the EUA Act. Safety here really refers to cybersecurity and protecting privacy of individuals, which particularly, I'm sure in the medical domain, is going to be very, very important.
Yeah. I wonder if I could just kind of like jump on that, because you also mentioned the idea of red teaming earlier.
Yeah.
I wonder if that kind of plays into that, kind of like stress testing your organization.
Yeah. So just for context for everyone, is basically red teaming is just a group of ethical hackers that basically just go at it at your models to, again, test for technical robustness. And so basically, yeah, the importance of that is to, again, essentially stress test the model through various different scenarios to make sure that, again, it remains robust. So in the same way as, for example, with GPT-4 or GPT-2, there was an incident where when you typed in a certain prompt, it actually gave you personal details of an individual, including name, address, phone number. So it's basically stress testing the model to evaluate for those sorts of risks and to understand those risks and how you're going to counteract those risks that come about then, in this case, splurting out of personal data or personal information, which is then a GDPR potential matter. Does that answer your question, Tab?
Yeah, it sounds like a good team building exercise, red teaming. Yeah, let's try and break this thing, y'all.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly it. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Not a problem.
So Fredrik, your second question.
Yeah, I was wondering about fairness, because I guess the way I'm thinking about it is that you can try and have fairness when it comes to, let's say, just 2 different groups of people. You could try and be fair by not putting those as input variables, into a system.
Yeah.
But you could also try and be fair by trying to make sure that these groups, like on the outcome, don't have a difference. So there are various ways to think about fairness, and it's not clear necessarily which one to choose.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether the EU has commented anything on that.
Yeah, no, really good question. Basically, the EUA Act does not talk about fairness, sadly. That is obviously something to consider because there's a few stop gaps from the EUA Act that really doesn't cover all of the 7 ethical principles that were defined by that high-level expert group. Fairness is one of them. And you've highlighted some, like, a really important problem about understanding fairness and what do you choose. Because of course there's two routes. There's either group fairness, where you're basically making sure that groups of individuals are treated equitably, or you're going down to an individual level and you're making sure that, for example, this person is quite similar to this person, so therefore they should get the same outcome. And which one do you choose? And of course, even when you go down to further beyond the metrics as well, when you look at kind of demographic parity or equal opportunity or quality of odds, isn't it? And sometimes you might get it that it's fair in one case and not fair in another. And again, you have the Simpsons paradox. So it's basically about defining within your own organization how you define fairness and your justification for it. I think that's really all you can do in that case. But no, to your point, there's not a lot around fairness, but that's where standards come in as well. So there's 24,027, which talks about evaluating bias then in AI systems, and again, how to evaluate it through confusion matrix or any other metrics.
Thank you.
Not a problem.
Gino, have a question?
No comment on this. I've thought about this topic for several years now, and I just wanted to share my frustration with that there isn't like one single source of truth for what do we mean with fair, what do we mean with really non-discrimination. We have a discrimination act, Swedish Discrimination Act here in Sweden. It would be nice to get guidance from Diskrimineringsombudsmannen or whichever myndighet that does that, telling us how do we do this really. It's a bit scary for me that we are pretty much in the dark. We're doing stuff we don't know. Is it discriminatory or not? God knows. It's up to each team to decide. Yeah. I've researched a little bit on this. We have been writing a paper for 3-4 years together with a law scholar and a mathematician, but yeah.
No, I completely get your frustration with that, Gino. And basically it comes down to the main aspect of evaluating risks, because that's really what we all can do in an organization, right? We can only evaluate, understand our risk landscape, both internally and externally, and then essentially, how do we combat those risks? So in your example of fairness, what controls can we put in place in order to ensure that it is, quote unquote, as fair as possible? But again, that's up to you to decide what that acceptance criteria is. But again, those things are nicely laid out in 42001, for instance, ISO 42001, where it gives you like a really nice step-by-step guide as to how to evaluate risks, and even the controls as well of how to counteract those risks as well. So for example, for fairness, it would be about making sure data quality processes are in place, or making sure, or you're checking essentially the quality of the data really in that case. But appreciate your point there, Gino.
So, Alex, in your role as auditor, I don't know how much you can say. Maybe you can't say anything, but have you encountered any organizations or companies that have been really good at following these standards and practices that you outlined?
Yeah, very good question. I think I'm going to have to obviously answer in a very, very broad brushstroke answer here. But basically, the organizations that tend to best thrive are the ones that not only have the processes in place to evaluate risks and do internal audits, etc., but it's those that have the feedback mechanisms to continuously improve. So it's all good doing these things of evaluating risk, and then you're finding where your acceptance criteria is, etc. That's great, but then how do you feed that back to improving on a process? And those are the particularly ones that have the kind of best results. are those that actually understand, but also be prepared for the risk landscape of tomorrow.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had another, I don't know, like reflection slash question. With these explainability tools like Shapley values and Lime. Like I have a feeling that, for instance, Lime explanations can be quite brittle, and you shouldn't really trust them necessarily. So is there any sort of debate about that in this context? Or?
Worth reading a report from the Mozilla Foundation on AI transparency. They essentially surveyed AI developers, and they also found very similar conclusions to yours, where there are techniques in place to try and give you a more explainable answer, to look inside the model effectively, but it's about, one, the accessibility of those tools, and also whether you can trust those tools, because these tools are obviously restricted to kind of on an example basis, and they don't give you an understanding of model behavior itself. There is some interesting research going on. There's one paper that I read recently about essentially trying to manipulate neural activity to defend against hallucination by understanding the model's idea and understanding of deception, and then modulating neural activity towards truth-telling rather than being deceptive. So there's research going on in that angle to look at model behavior and change model behavior to be more truth-telling. But in terms of the transparency side, there needs to be more research. And as I've mentioned to students at Gothenburg University, that's their chance also to contribute to the field and provide some more clarity on this.
Yeah, that's definitely an area needs to be further explored. Yeah, cool. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have another one. I'm interested in, are there any other kind of what's the word, like concurrent regulations? I guess I'm especially wondering about the Council of Europe, if they're gonna kind of release anything. And this is kind of, I'm leaning into what's Britain doing about all this? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of concurrent legislation, there is a few. Haven't obviously researched those, but worth doing that research. UK stance, basically, it's now with a change of government that their appetite for AI legislation went from not at all to very much so. So with that, there is a process in place now, I think, where they're actually looking at regulation for AI technologies. Not sure whether it's going to be as firm as EU legislation, because of course they want to create some sort of competitive advantage in that way. So having a slightly lax regulatory environment might be beneficial. But as we've seen from GDPR, how it was EU legislation, and then when Brexit happened, it got swallowed into UK law as well. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little bit of a Brussels effect that will happen as well. That will see a kind of translation of at least some of the requirements into UK law as well. But it's just a question of what bits they actually take and what bits they change in order to create some sort of competitive advantage. But I think it's in the same with the US as well. It's dependent on quite a few factors in terms of, as we've seen with the California bill, right, that it got completely wiped out to pander to big tech, essentially. So there's a lot more to it than just law and what translates. It's also really the political angle as well on top of this.
Yes, as I'm sure this regulation also maybe had to pander a bit to certain law enforcement agencies in France and other countries, you know.
Of course, but then of course you're trying to like appease a lot of nations, right, that have very different attitudes towards privacy and different attitudes towards kind of being competitive as well against major economies like China, India, and the US, right, in terms of these, in terms of AI in particular. So of course it's trying to balance those. So no wonder why people were kind of still discussing into midnight in the plenary discussions, right, to then try and get final text out. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's taken 3 years in the process to get here, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if the UK takes a similar-ish, well, later, obviously, less because it's a smaller country, but yeah.
Cool.
Ying, question.
You're on mute, Ying.
Okay, thank you.
There we go.
I forget. Thank you for the presentation. It's a super important topic, I think, nowadays. And today we talk about the EU lease regulation and the EU AI Act. What's about the status of US? How much trust we can use this ChatGPT-4, for example? Thank you.
Yeah, so is the question about essentially looking at US legislation then? Yeah.
Yeah.
Really good one. So basically the US in terms of the federal approach, so meaning the whole country, there's only been that executive order currently where it's, from what I interpret so far, it's more guidance rather than actual legal text. And obviously that was done at a very convenient time of the UK's AI safety summit as well. So very nicely timed to put some, at least some guidance around it. The AI landscape is more piecemeal in the US. It's more on a state level. So for example, in New Jersey, they have a bill for automatic employment decision tools to make sure that, obviously includes AI in that framework as well, that if AI is used in those employment decision contexts, then these systems have to be audited and make sure they are compliant with any discriminatory law and any discrimination laws that exist in the US. So there's that angle. And again, we've seen the California bill that was trying to at least create some safety mechanisms around AI, but that got scrapped very, very rapidly. And again, that was them pandering to big tech. So it's again, it's a very piecemeal picture, and sadly one that I can't give you in a nice condensed answer, but I can give you at least those examples as a way of just understanding that it's very piecemeal and it's very state specific.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, I think everyone has had their chance to ask questions. Super interesting Q&A, as well as a great presentation. So thanks a lot, Alex, and yeah, have a great Friday, everyone, and a nice weekend after that, and see you in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Take care, everyone. Lovely meeting you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.